This is the Visual Principles lecture for part one of the ART161 graphic design class that will cover the second 6 design principles for part one of this project. Now, we looked at the first 6 principles in the previous lecture, and the 7th principle that we are looking at is going to be rhythm. Now, rhythm is the repetition or alternation of elements, and often this is using defined intervals between them. Now, rhythm can create a sense of movement and can also establish a pattern and texture. Looking at the examples here, these examples depict a flowing rhythm through the use of repetition. And instead of having a regular shape, there's this sense of movement to the patterns that we see. On the left, this Beethoven poster, which has these organic flowing rhythms of these concentric circular shapes that interlock and create these very interesting sort of asymmetrical balance here. And then on the right, we can see the symmetrical balance that uses rhythm to articulate a inflatable line that ties into this show that it was involving inflatable structures. Now, there are many different kinds of rhythm, and rhythm is often defined by this feeling of something that is evoked by the viewer. Now, repeating visual elements such as a line, color, shape, and texture, and even the value of the image tends to unify the total effect of work of art, as well as create a rhythm. The next principle here is tension. And tension is created through a lack of harmony and balance. It often involves trapped spaces or items that create an uneasiness for the viewer. Now, in some cases, you want to use tension. Over here on the left, we can see this very organized structure of these different planes and lines within the space. But as we start to deconstruct that and use the sense of tension and chaos within the repetition of these, we get a very different feel that is coming through this layout. And this can be useful within design. In both of these examples here, we can see the use of tension and the sort of elements that are unspooling here from the typography with using these lines, or the sort of trapped point between these two different three-dimensional planes here on the right. And this ties into the next principle of space. And space is the format or amount of area the design contains. Now, the placement of objects in the layout or structure can emphasize or de-emphasize this area. It can also refer to graphic abilities, or to the graphics ability, to overlap and portray depth within the composition and even scale. Here we can see a sort of three-dimensional space through this use of repetition and these darker shades of colors that are happening on the left, creating this sort of illusion, if we will. And same thing over here on the right, which plays with this sense of illusion through the use of space, using these graphic planes with these nonsensical shapes. Now, the next principle is order. And order is a system or arrangement that has been directed. An organizational structure creates rationale for decisions of the viewer. And we can see that order has a lot of overlap with unity, right? And that's what you're going to start to notice, is that some of these principles really go hand in hand, while others are more contrasting of one another. We can see this use of order here throughout this different branding of these catalogs that uses the same placement to all of the different elements, and a common theme within the color and the different shapes that are die cut out of these brochures. Packaging oftentimes uses order and unity as well. And order can be a great way to create consistency within the branding of a company and the placement of different elements to show that they are all related, but to also call out points of emphasis within the design. Now, in contrast to order, we have chaos, and chaos is tied closer into tension and asymmetry. Chaos is also created through this lack of harmony and balance, and it frequently disregards common design conventions, often creating a composition that's difficult for the viewer to look at or possibly understand. Sometimes the use of chaos and tension can be used to make the viewer sort of work for what it is that they are viewing within the space. These are examples by the designer David Carson, who really amplified the use of chaos within his publications of Ray Gun magazine, oftentimes creating articles that were not even legible to the viewer, but in his eyes expressed the content of the article or the band or music that was being showcased within that particular publication. And then we have repetition. And repetition is reusing an element or process to create a relationship or strengthen the unity, order, and balance of a composition. So here again, we can see other principles being tied into this. We can see the use of repetition here within the branding for the paper company Mohawk, and they're actually deconstructing their logo to showcase different printing capabilities that they have on these large format papers. And even though they are using different shapes and different images here within the posters, we can see that they are tied into this use of repetition of the same shapes and the different colors that are being used and the different cropping and layouts of those. Again, repetition can be a great way to articulate parts of branding elements or different parts of a design. Here we can see Target utilizing repetition within their ad campaign. Now, before we go on, I just wanted to talk really quickly about the difference between repetition and rhythm, because often this comes up. And what I like to think about with repetition and rhythm is repetition is typically something like a pattern or some sort of graphic that you can almost start to guess what is going to come next, right? Looking at these designs here, you can almost start to say, well, if I was going to continue this pattern, I would use the same spacing and the same placement within this sort of grid. Where rhythm, and I'll just shoot back here really quickly, is not quite as obvious to assume what is going to happen next. And a good way to think about rhythm is tying it into music. If you think about maybe a group of musicians who are coming together and having some sort of jam session, for example, it may sound really good, but they don't necessarily know what the next note that's going to be played is. There's a rhythm within the music, but it's not quite as predictable as something that might be repetitive within some style of music, right? So that is sometimes a good way to think about these two different principles. So at this point, that covers all 12 principles. Remember, just to review, we have the 3 elements of design using points, lines, and planes. And then the 12 principles of design, which we covered in this lecture. Now, again, make sure to refer to the tutorial for this project within the assignment module on Canvas. And this will show you how to get started on Adobe Illustrator, graphically translating these into vector elements based on the sketches that you create. There's also a template for your sketches found in the assignment section in Canvas, and you are more than welcome to use that and either print it out, or you can use your own sketch paper as well. Just make sure that you are using square compositional boxes if you are using hand-drawn sketches. And that concludes the lecture for the Visual Principles Part 1 assignment.